Shabbat Shalom, it's really good to see you. I'm here because of a choice that I made 6 years ago. 6 years ago, I was the spiritual leader and chaplain of an assisted living facility here in Orange County. And twice a year, I used to take a vacation right after Passover and after High Holy Days, because those were the busiest seasons of my year, and I needed the break to recuperate it so I could come back and do the job that I really loved. 6 years ago, 2014, I took that vacation after Passover, and I went up north to the Esalen Institute to go on retreat and rest. And while I was there, I realized that I needed more than a week, that I really needed a vacation. I'd been there for 15 years, and I was too exhausted to really go back and do the job well. So when I went back, I asked for a sabbatical. And it was not the policy of the company that ran the facility to give sabbaticals. And I knew that I wasn't going to make it for months on end till High Holy Days if I didn't take a break. So I chose, and it was a painful decision, to take a 3-month unpaid leave of absence. And during those 3 months, I was not going to limit myself. I was going to just rest and recuperate and do whatever I loved. I was in the middle of writing my book. I booked an Airbnb in Portland, Oregon. I went up there, I finished my book. I spent time just being with myself, with my friends, hiking, just being out in nature and really filling back up. I went to the East Coast after finishing my book. I visited with family, uploaded the book, came back. By that time I'd left in May, and it was the end of August, and it was my 59th birthday on the very weekend before I was due to go back to work. I felt good, and I also had this intuition that when I went back to work, it wasn't going to be the same, because in that 3 months, I had changed. And I wasn't quite sure what was going to happen or where I was going. And it felt a little bit like jumping off a cliff. And so I decided to celebrate my 59th birthday by doing something daring. I was going to embody this feeling by jumping off a cliff. And so I hired a paragliding instructor. I met him in Malibu. I made sure he had not had any accidents in 25 years. You know, got to be careful. And we drove up 3,000 feet to the top of the cliff in Malibu, right on the coast, overlooking Pacific Coast Highway. It was gorgeous. And he strapped me to his chest so that I was facing out like I was in a baby carrier. And he said, okay, now I want you to run to the edge of the cliff and keep running. When the ground disappears beneath your feet, just keep running. Okay? So we're running, and as I get closer to the edge of the cliff, I'm not afraid of heights, but I have a good respect for them. As I get closer, I feel myself going, no, I can't do this, I can't do this. And I'm running. And suddenly I realize there's no ground. I'm running in the air. I didn't jump. I was lifted. And this was such a metaphor for me. And we glided through the air for the next 30 minutes, looking at the most beautiful scenery of Malibu. And then when we had to come in for a landing, he said to me, now I want you to straighten up, and when your feet hit the ground, I want you to make sure that you stand straight, because if you fall over, you could pull the glider out to sea. So I put my feet down and we touched ground, and I did my best to stay upright, but he was behind me and the wind was blowing, and he pushed me forward, and I fell flat on my face into the sand. he got mad and he said, I told you to stay straight. And then he started yelling at the people sitting on the beach. And he said, grab the glider, grab the glider. And everybody got up and they grabbed the glider and made sure that we didn't go out to sea and get drowned. What I learned from this experience was such a feeling of abundance and knowing that if I trusted, I could be lifted. And that if I landed, there was a community out there to make sure that I didn't drown. In today's Torah portion, which is, we read the two, Behar and Behukotai together, and it's the last two parshiot, portions of Vayikra, Leviticus, the third book of the Torah. We meet Moses in chapter 25. The Torah tells us that God was speaking to Moses, Behar Sinai, on Mount Sinai, and telling him to speak to the Jewish people. And he says in verse 3, 6 years you may sow your field, and 6 years you may prune your vineyard and gather in the yield. But in the 7th year, the land shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, a Sabbath of the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest or gather the grapes of your untrimmed vines. It shall be a year of complete rest for the land. Now remember, this was an agricultural society. They depended on this produce. Imagine being told you cannot produce anything, you cannot use anything. For a whole year, you're not going to get paid. I can kind of imagine what it felt like because, that 3-month leave of absence that I took, it was difficult to figure out how I was going to do it. And when I went back and I knew that, wow, I cannot stay here, and I did end up leaving 6 months later, I also had to take that thought of, what will I do? What will I do if I don't get paid? I read a note that my foster brother, Rabbi Chaim Fachler, sent about a resource, Sefer HaChinuch, 13th century Spain it was written, and it gives us some insight about this Shabbat rest. It's a rest from everything we do to the land and what the land itself does in that year. But it's not about us and it's not about the land. It's about God. It's the year, it's the Sabbath for the Lord. That's an awful lot of power. It's a powerful command, and yet if we look a few verses later, in verse 20 of that same chapter, it says, and should you ask, what are we to eat in the 7th year, if we may neither sow nor gather in our crops? God says, I will ordain my blessing for you in the 6th year, so that it shall yield a crop sufficient for 3 years. So now imagine if you're a farmer and you're told, okay, you have to let the land rest for a year, but you're going to have enough the year before to last you not only through the 7th year, but the 8th and the 9th as well. I think if I were a farmer, I would feel pretty much like I was lifted. Sefer HaChinuch also tells us of another insight, and it's vatranut. To be mevater is to let go, to yield. If every 7th year you see your possessions being given away freely, you're yielding and you're understanding the power of sharing. You're understanding the power of the community that will be there for you as well. In this unprecedented time, when we're sheltering in place, we're on a sabbatical of sorts. Our Rebbitzin, Ellen Kaufman-Dosick, who is a master practitioner of psychospiritual therapy, told us 6 weeks ago how to look at this time. She said, this is a time when we get to have an extended Shabbat rest. She said we get to stop doing and start being, and that it was a foretaste of the messianic times and a return to the Garden of Eden. When we focus on being, we become aware of the divine. It's a Shabbat for the Lord. When I focused on being during that time that I took off, it opened me up to the whole new life I have now and how I was able to be here today. And though it might feel like jumping off a cliff, the worst part is running towards the edge. And can we trust that we will be lifted? And if we fall, that people will be there for us? Because I took that time, I also now take the time to study with one of my favorite teachers. And this week, I took a webinar with her. I'm taking one that's writing through fear and storytelling. And she reminded me of one of my favorite poems by John O'Donoghue. I'd like to share it with you. This is the time to be slow. Lie low to the wall until the bitter weather passes. Try as best you can not to let the wire brush of doubt scrape from your heart all sense of yourself and your hesitant light. If you remain generous, time will come good, and you will find your feet again on the fresh pastures of promise, where the air will be kind and blushed with beginning. As we end the book of Vayikra, we say, Chazak, Chazak, v'nit chazek. Be strong, and may you be strengthened. It's the end of the book and the beginning of something else. Shabbat Shalom.